August 15, 1944. Somewhere above the blood-soaked fields of occupied France, German Oberarzt Heinrich Wolff stands frozen beside a makeshift field hospital tent, his binoculars trembling in his hands as he watches something that defies every principle of military medicine he's ever known. Through the smoke and chaos, an American transport aircraft circles low over the battlefield. But instead of dropping supplies or paratroopers, wounded soldiers on stretchers are being hoisted into its belly. Living men with shattered bodies ascending into the sky while artillery shells still thunder across the valley below. "Das ist Wahnsinn," Wolff whispers to his exhausted medical staff, his voice barely audible over the distant explosions. Madness! They're flying the dying into the clouds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Wolff witnessed that summer morning was not madness, it was revolution. A revolution that would transform military medicine forever, save hundreds of thousands of lives, and prove that sometimes the most impossible idea is the only one worth pursuing. This is the story of how American military doctors dared to lift the wounded into the sky when everyone said it couldn't be done, when the enemy called it propaganda, and when even their own commanders thought they'd lost their minds. Before 1942, evacuation of wounded soldiers looked virtually identical to what it had been in the Great War 25 years earlier. Wounded men were loaded onto stretchers, carried to collection points, transferred to ambulances if they were lucky, and then began an agonizing journey that could take days or even weeks, first by truck over cratered roads, then by hospital train if rail lines hadn't been destroyed, then by ship if they needed to cross water. Every bump, every delay, every hour of travel increased the chances that a survivable wound would become a fatal one. The statistics were damning. In early 1942, American military medical records showed that approximately 40% of soldiers who died from combat injuries didn't die from the wounds themselves, they died from complications during transport. Infection set in during the long truck rides, shock deepened as men bounced along ruined roads for hours. Internal bleeding that could have been stopped in an operating room instead became fatal because the operating room was 3 days away. The human cost was staggering, but more than that, it was unnecessary. Captain Thomas Brennan, a surgeon from Boston who'd served in North Africa, wrote in his journal in January 1942, "We patch these boys up as best we can in tents with mud floors and limited supplies, knowing full well that the 200-kilometer journey to a real hospital will kill half of them. We're not losing them to German bullets, we're losing them to distance and time. There has to be a better way." There was a better way, but it would require thinking in a way that military medicine had never thought before. It would require turning the sky itself into a highway of mercy.
Colonel Richard Ashford had an unusual background for an Army medical officer. Before attending medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, he'd been a civilian pilot, barnstorming across county fairs and teaching flying lessons to pay for his education. He understood both medicine and aviation in ways few men did. In January 1942, sitting in his office at Patterson Field Air Base outside Baltimore, Ashford stared at casualty reports from the Philippines and North Africa and saw the problem with brutal clarity. "A truck covers maybe 40 kilometers in an hour over bombed roads," he told his skeptical staff officers. "A C-47 transport can cover 300 kilometers in that same hour, and it doesn't care if the roads are cratered or the bridges are blown. We're thinking about this all wrong. We're trying to bring the hospitals closer to the front. What if instead we bring the front closer to the hospitals?" His suggestion was met with immediate resistance. Medical doctrine held that transporting critically wounded men by air was dangerous, even suicidal. The altitude changes would affect blood pressure, the cold would worsen shock, the vibration and turbulence could restart bleeding. The wounded needed rest and stability, not to be rattled around in the belly of a cargo plane at 3,000 meters. But Ashford had done his calculations. Yes, there are risks, he acknowledged, but the risk of a 2-hour flight is nothing compared to the certainty of a 3-day truck journey. We're not asking if flying is safe, we're asking if it's safer than what we're doing now. And gentlemen, anything is safer than what we're doing now. The first documented attempt at air evacuation had actually occurred in September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines. A young Army doctor named Lieutenant James Cortland faced an impossible situation. A private named Daniel Walsh had been critically injured in a training accident at Clark Airfield. A piece of machinery had crushed his chest, and he was bleeding internally. The nearest hospital with the equipment to save him was in Manila, 80 kilometers away. By truck over rough roads, it would take at least 4 hours, probably 6. Walsh wouldn't survive too. Cortland made a decision that could have ended his career. He commandeered a P-40 Warhawk fighter plane that was being serviced, had mechanics rip out the rear ammunition compartment and radio equipment, and created a space barely large enough for a man to lie down. They loaded Walsh into that cramped space with nothing but morphine and prayer. The flight took 35 minutes. Walsh survived. The incident was recorded in medical logs, but largely forgotten in the chaos after Pearl Harbor. But Ashford found that report in early 1942, and it confirmed what he already believed. Air evacuation wasn't just possible, it was life-saving. Now he just had to convince the Army to let him try it on a larger scale.
The opportunity came in November 1942 when American forces landed in Morocco as part of Operation Torch. The North African theater presented unique challenges: vast distances, scorching desert heat, limited infrastructure, and a highly mobile front line that shifted by dozens of kilometers every day. Traditional evacuation methods were overwhelmed almost immediately. Major Vincent Palmer, the chief medical officer for the 12th Air Force, received orders that seemed designed to fail. Organize medical support for 30,000 troops spread across hundreds of kilometers of desert with only a handful of field hospitals and ambulances that kept breaking down in the sand. Palmer knew Ashford's theories about air evacuation. He also knew he had no other options. "We're going to turn cargo planes into ambulances," Palmer announced at a staff meeting in late November. "I know how it sounds, I know the risks, but I also know that right now we have men dying in the desert because we can't reach them in time. We have to try." The C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the Douglas DC-3, became their vehicle of choice. It was rugged, reliable, had a large cargo compartment, and could operate from rough airstrips. But converting a transport plane designed to carry supplies into a flying hospital required solving dozens of problems simultaneously. Engineers worked around the clock. They installed metal brackets along the interior walls to hold stretchers in 4-tier racks. 18 lying patients could fit in a single aircraft. They added insulation to combat the freezing temperatures at altitude. They created a narrow aisle down the center so medical personnel could move between patients during flight. They installed additional oxygen supplies and primitive electrical systems to power medical equipment. On February 7, 1943, Captain Nathan Cross stood beside his C-47 at the airfield in Casablanca, watching medics load 12 wounded soldiers into the converted transport. Cross had flown supply missions, paratroop drops, and reconnaissance flights, but this was different. These weren't crates of ammunition or bundles of supplies. These were living men whose survival depended entirely on him getting them to a hospital 300 kilometers away as quickly and smoothly as possible. The flight to Iran took exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes. Nurse Lieutenant Rebecca Foster, one of the first women to fly medical evacuation missions, worked constantly during that flight, checking vital signs, adjusting bandages, administering morphine. She later wrote, "I had trained in hospitals, in ambulances, even in field tents, but never had I worked in an environment that shook and rattled and roared like that. Every instinct told me these men needed rest and stillness. Instead, we were subjecting them to noise, vibration, and altitude changes. I was terrified we were killing them." They weren't killing them. They were saving them. Of the 12 men evacuated on that first mission, 11 made full recoveries. The 12th died, but his wounds had been so severe that he would have died anywhere. The miracle was that 11 others lived who would have certainly died on a 3-day truck journey. The success of that first mission opened the floodgates. Within weeks, medical air evacuation was occurring daily across North Africa. The 87th Medical Air Evacuation Squadron was officially formed, and suddenly dozens of C-47s bearing Red Cross markings were shuttling back and forth between frontline airstrips and rear area hospitals. The true proving ground came in March 1943 during the brutal battles around Tunisia. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, desperate and cornered, launched a fierce counterattack through the Kasserine Pass. American forces, many of them green troops seeing combat for the first time, took heavy casualties, over 2,400 wounded in a matter of days. The field hospitals were overwhelmed, tents overflowed with wounded men lying on the ground. Supplies ran short. The nearest full-capacity hospital was in Algiers, 400 kilometers away across mountainous terrain. By traditional evacuation methods, it would take a week to clear the backlog. Many of the wounded wouldn't survive that long. This was the moment air evacuation proved its worth. In just 72 hours, aircraft of the 87th Squadron flew 47 missions and evacuated 658 wounded soldiers. What would have taken 2 weeks by ground transport was accomplished in 3 days. Mortality rates for evacuated wounded dropped to less than 2%, a figure unheard of in military medicine. Major Palmer, watching the endless stream of aircraft landing and taking off, realized they had fundamentally changed the nature of combat medicine. "We're not just moving wounded faster," he told his staff, "we're changing the equation. A soldier knows that if he's hit, he'll be in a real hospital within hours. That changes morale. That changes everything." Across the battlefield, German military intelligence was receiving reports that seemed too extraordinary to be true. Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots reported seeing American transport aircraft marked with red crosses flying constantly between frontline positions and rear areas. Radio intercepts confirmed coordination between air squadrons and medical units. Captured American documents described an elaborate air evacuation system, but German High Command refused to believe it. At headquarters in Tunisia, General Lieutenant Gustav Reinhardt examined the intelligence reports with his chief medical officer, Oberarzt Friedrich Zimmermann. "This is propaganda," Reinhardt declared, tossing the papers aside. "The Americans want us to think they have some miraculous medical system to demoralize our troops. You don't put critically wounded men in airplanes. It's medically absurd." Zimmermann wasn't so sure. "Her General, we have multiple confirmed sightings. Our pilots have seen these aircraft. The pattern is consistent. Then they're moving lightly wounded men for propaganda photographs, or their supply flights were misidentifying. The idea of flying critically injured soldiers hundreds of kilometers is fantasy. Our own medical doctrine, built on decades of German military science, is clear. Wounded men need stability, rest, and careful ground transport. The Americans are either lying or they're recklessly gambling with their soldiers' lives." The irony was that German medical care at the front was often superior to American care. German field hospitals had better equipment, more experienced surgeons, and could perform more complex operations closer to the battlefield. But their evacuation system was stuck in 1918. Hospital trains that ran mostly at night to avoid air attacks. Ambulance convoys that took days to navigate destroyed infrastructure. The Germans were winning the battle of immediate care, but losing the war of time and distance. One of the critical innovations that made air evacuation work was the creation of an entirely new medical specialty, the flight nurse. Before World War II, this profession didn't exist. By 1943, it was saving lives daily. Women like Lieutenant Foster underwent intensive training at the School of Aviation Medicine in San Antonio, Texas. They learned aerospace physiology, how altitude affects blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and wound healing. They practiced working in cramped, vibrating spaces. They studied how to manage multiple critical patients simultaneously with minimal equipment. Most importantly, they learned to make life or death decisions alone, in the air, with no doctor to consult. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore, a B-17 gunner who'd been shot down over Sicily, remembered his evacuation flight. "I was in and out of consciousness, in terrible pain. I remember this nurse, I never learned her name, working over me constantly during the flight, checking my pulse, adjusting my bandages, talking to me, keeping me focused. Later the doctors told me I'd been bleeding internally and probably had less than an hour left when they loaded me on that plane. That nurse, working in that rattling tin can at 2,000 meters, kept me alive long enough to reach the operating table. She saved my life." The flight nurses developed techniques through trial and error. They learned that patients with chest wounds did better at lower altitudes, so flights with thoracic injuries were routed at 1,500 meters, even if it meant greater exposure to anti-aircraft fire. They discovered that talking to conscious patients constantly, maintaining human connection, reduced shock better than any medication. They created improvised stabilization techniques for situations the textbooks had never imagined. By late spring 1943, American air evacuation had evolved from desperate experiment to systematic operation. The 87th Squadron had been joined by additional units. Standardized procedures were written. Aircraft were purpose-modified rather than hastily converted. The entire system functioned with precision. Near the front lines, casualty collection points were established at or near airstrips. When an aircraft delivered supplies or troops forward, it didn't return empty, it carried wounded back. This maximized efficiency and ensured a constant flow of evacuation capacity. Doctors at collection points performed rapid triage. Who needed immediate evacuation? Who could wait? Who required stabilization first? The critical innovation was the stabilize and evacuate doctrine that Ashford had championed. Instead of attempting complex surgeries in field conditions, doctors focused on three things: stop the bleeding, prevent shock, and get the patient to a real hospital as fast as possible. A soldier with a shattered leg didn't need his leg set in a tent hospital. He needed an IV, morphine, and a 2-hour flight to a surgical ward with proper equipment and specialists. Statistics told the story. In World War I, 8% of wounded American soldiers died. In the early months of World War II, using traditional ground evacuation, the rate was similar. By mid-1943, with air evacuation fully operational, the mortality rate for evacuated wounded had dropped to 2.3%. For every 100 wounded soldiers who reached a medical station, 2 more were surviving who would have died just a year earlier. Captain William Sterling, a surgeon who worked at a receiving hospital in Algiers, witnessed the transformation firsthand. In January, we'd get wounded men who'd been on trucks and trains for 3 or 4 days. They'd arrive septic, in shock, barely alive. We'd lose half of them no matter what we did. By June, men were arriving within hours of being wounded, stable, with their wounds properly dressed. Our success rate went through the roof. We weren't better surgeons, we were just getting patients while they were still savable.
The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, in July 1943 became the first major amphibious assault where air evacuation was planned from the beginning rather than improvised afterward. Colonel Theodore Lawrence, coordinating medical operations, had 12 squadrons of C-47s at his disposal, nearly 200 aircraft dedicated to medical evacuation. On paper, they could evacuate 3,500 wounded men per day. In practice, they did better. The invasion began on July 10th with 160,000 Allied troops hitting Sicilian beaches. Casualties in the first 48 hours exceeded 2,300 wounded. The air evacuation system swung into action immediately. Aircraft landed on captured airstrips, some barely more than flattened fields, within hours of their capture. Wounded soldiers were being flown off the island before the beachheads were even fully secured. Private Joseph Carmichael, wounded by shrapnel near Gela on July 11th, found himself on an aircraft by the afternoon of July 12th. "It was insane," he later recalled. "Yesterday I was in a landing craft throwing up from fear. This morning I was hit.
By afternoon, I was in an airplane. By evening, I was in a clean hospital bed in North Africa with nurses and doctors and real food. It felt like I'd jumped forward in time. German forces on Sicily watched the evacuation flights with a mixture of awe and frustration. They shot down 3 C-47s during the campaign, but the loss rate was negligible compared to the number of lives saved. Luftwaffe pilots reported that targeting the clearly marked medical aircraft felt dishonorable. Many deliberately avoided engaging them even when they had the opportunity. By the time Sicily fell in August, American medical aviation had evacuated over 13,000 wounded. The system had proven it could handle not just steady casualties, but massive spikes in wounded from major battles. More importantly, word was spreading among American soldiers. If you got hit, you'd be in a real hospital by dinner time. That knowledge, that confidence, became as important as body armor or artillery support.
Dawn broke gray and cold over southern England on the morning that would change history. At Greenham Common Airfield, 40 kilometers west of London, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Morrison stood beside the operations tent, watching crews perform final checks on 36 C-47 aircraft painted with prominent red crosses. The largest amphibious invasion in human history, Operation Overlord, had begun hours earlier across the English Channel. By now, thousands of Allied soldiers were fighting their way up the beaches of Normandy. And by Morrison's calculations, thousands more were already wounded. "Sir, we received the signal," Captain David Hutchinson reported, holding a decoded message. "First airstrip secured. Beach casualties estimated at 1,800 in the American sector alone, with numbers rising. We're cleared to begin operations at 1400 hours." Morrison nodded slowly, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. They had planned for this moment for 8 months. 12 squadrons, 192 aircraft dedicated solely to medical evacuation from the invasion beaches. The system had worked in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, but never on this scale, never under these conditions, never with so many lives depending on getting it exactly right. The challenge was staggering. The invasion beaches were still under artillery fire. The airstrips were barely more than flattened fields bulldozed out of farmland behind the dunes, cratered by shell fire, exposed to German counter-battery fire. Aircraft would have to land under combat conditions, load wounded while shells fell nearby, and take off again through a sky where German fighters might appear at any moment. By 1330 hours, the first wave of medical C-47s was airborne, flying low over the channel toward the smoke-shrouded coast of France. Captain Robert Shaw piloted the lead aircraft, with flight nurse Lieutenant Catherine Hayes and medical corpsman Sergeant Leonard Fisher in the cargo bay, preparing for what awaited them. Shaw had flown 53 evacuation missions in the Mediterranean. He thought he'd seen everything. But as the French coast materialized through the haze, beaches still crowded with landing craft, the water churned by explosions, smoke rising from burning vehicles, he realized this was different. This was history happening in real time, and his job was to fly straight into the middle of it. The airstrip designated A-21 Easy near Omaha Beach was barely recognizable as such. The runway was a 600-meter stretch of compressed dirt and metal matting marked by white panels, surrounded by craters. Medical collection tents had been erected just 50 meters from the strip, and even from altitude Shaw could see dozens of stretchers laid out on the ground, with more arriving constantly from the beaches. "This is Mercy Leader to all Mercy flights. Weather is breaking over the channel. We have a window. All aircraft proceed to assigned strips. Load quickly, depart immediately. Do not wait to fill capacity. Get whoever's ready and get them out. Good luck." Shaw brought his C-47 down through sporadic anti-aircraft fire. The landing was rough, the metal matting buckling under the aircraft's weight, but they were down. Before the propellers even stopped turning, medics were running toward the aircraft with stretchers. Lieutenant Hayes jumped down from the cargo door and immediately understood why they'd been told not to wait for full loads. The collection point was overwhelmed. Wounded men lay everywhere, some on stretchers, many simply on the ground covered with blankets. Medics moved between them with the exhausted efficiency of men who'd been working without sleep for 12 hours. The sound of artillery was constant, a deep, rolling thunder that never quite stopped. "We can take 18, Hayes told the chief medical officer, a captain whose uniform was soaked with blood. "Who goes first?"
"These 12. The captain pointed to a group of stretchers. Thoracic wounds, head trauma, severe hemorrhage. They won't survive the night if they stay here. The next 6 are on their way up from the beach now." Loading 12 wounded men while shells impacted a few hundred meters away was the most terrifying thing Hayes had ever done. But she'd trained for exactly this. So had Sergeant Fisher. They worked with swift precision, securing stretchers to the racks, checking IVs, making quick assessments of each man's condition. Private First Class Daniel Brenner, 19 years old from Ohio, had taken shrapnel across his chest and abdomen. He was conscious, eyes wide with pain and fear. "Am I going to die?" he asked Hayes as she secured his stretcher. "Not today," she told him firmly. "We're getting you out of here. Hospital in England in 2 hours. You're going home." 13 minutes after landing, Shaw powered up the engines. The takeoff was worse than the landing. The aircraft struggled to gain altitude with the weight of 12 wounded men and full medical equipment, shells bursting close enough that the concussion rocked the plane. But they cleared the tree line, banked west toward the channel, and suddenly they were out of it, flying through clear air with England ahead. In the cargo bay, Hayes and Fisher moved constantly between patients. Brenner's blood pressure was dropping, possible internal bleeding. She adjusted his IV, administered plasma, talked to him constantly to keep him conscious. Corporal Michael Stevens, unconscious with a head wound, needed his airway cleared every few minutes. "How long to Portsmouth?" Hayes called to the cockpit. 97 minutes. How are they doing?" 4 critical, 8 serious. We need to make this fast." They made it in 93 minutes. The aircraft touched down at Portsmouth Naval Hospital's airfield at 16:47 hours. Ambulances and medical teams were waiting. The 12 wounded soldiers were off the aircraft and into operating rooms within 20 minutes of landing. 11 of them survived. Private First Class Brenner was in surgery within 35 minutes of leaving the beach and made a full recovery. Shaw's aircraft was refueled, restocked with medical supplies, and airborne again by 17:45 hours, heading back toward Normandy. They would make 3 more trips that day. Other squadrons were doing the same. The air bridge between the invasion beaches and English hospitals ran constantly, aircraft taking off and landing in an endless rotation. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, American medical aviation had evacuated 1,247 wounded from Normandy. The system that had seemed impossible 3 years earlier was now saving lives by the thousand, and they were just getting started. In August 1944, a remarkable document reached Allied intelligence through a captured German medical officer. It was a report commissioned by Wehrmacht Medical Services analyzing American air evacuation and comparing it to German systems. The conclusions were damning for Germany. "The enemy has achieved what we believed impossible. Through systematic air evacuation, they've reduced mortality among wounded by 400% compared to our forces. Their system is integrated, efficient, and operates regardless of ground conditions or tactical situation. They have made speed of evacuation their primary medical doctrine, while we remain committed to extensive field treatment that delays transport. The result is that American soldiers have significantly better survival rates than our own." The report made specific recommendations: establish German air evacuation, convert transport aircraft to medical use, train specialized medical flight crews. But it was far too late. By August 1944, Germany had lost air superiority completely. What few transport aircraft remained were desperately needed for supplying isolated units and evacuating surrounded garrisons. There were no resources left for medical aviation. German soldiers knew it.
Letters captured from German POWs frequently mentioned the American medical system with a mixture of envy and bitterness. One letter from Gefreiter Hans Schneider to his wife, written in July 1944 before his capture, was particularly telling. "Yesterday, I watched American aircraft land right behind their lines to take away their wounded. We have men who have been waiting 3 days for transport to a hospital. They value their soldiers' lives. I wonder if our command values ours at all."
The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. By then, American medical aviation had evacuated 1,176,048 wounded soldiers by air. Of those, 97.5% survived to go home. The numbers represented one of the greatest achievements of military medicine in history. At a press conference in Washington 3 weeks after VE Day, Army Surgeon General Lieutenant General Norman Kirk presented those statistics to journalists and members of Congress. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have fundamentally changed military medicine. Through air evacuation, through the courage of our flight nurses and pilots, through the innovation of our medical officers, we have saved approximately 150,000 American lives that would have been lost in previous wars. 150,000 men who will return to their families, their careers, their lives. That is the legacy of this war's medical revolution." The press conference generated headlines, but the real impact was quieter and more profound. In small towns across America, men came home who wouldn't have in earlier wars. Young men who'd been wounded in France or Germany or Italy, who'd been put on aircraft within hours of being hit, who'd received care that saved their lives. They became the living testament to what innovation and determination could achieve. In the years after the war, as German generals wrote their memoirs and analyzed their defeat, the American medical evacuation system was frequently cited as an example of Allied superiority in practical innovation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt made a remarkable admission in his post-war interrogation. "We Germans prided ourselves on our military organization, our discipline, our thoroughness. But the Americans taught us that sometimes thoroughness is less important than speed, that perfect care delivered too late is worthless compared to adequate care delivered immediately. We understood firepower, they understood time." General Alfred Jodl was even more direct. "The Americans turned their medical service into a weapon. A soldier who knows he will be saved if wounded fights differently than one who knows he will likely die." The psychological impact was as significant as their material superiority. Perhaps most poignant was the testimony of Dr. Kurt Müller, a German military surgeon captured in France. His report included this passage: "I believed our system was superior, but I have watched American medical personnel save lives we would have considered hopeless. Most humbling, they value every soldier's life regardless of rank or background. Our system treated soldiers as resources to be expended. Theirs treats them as human beings to be saved. That difference decided this war." The end of the war didn't end the revolution in medical evacuation. It exported it to civilian life. In 1946, the first civilian air ambulance service in America began operations in New York, directly modeled on military experience. Dr. Samuel Morris, who'd served as a flight surgeon in Europe, founded the service using converted military aircraft and hiring former military flight nurses. "We proved during the war that rapid air transport saves lives. Why should that benefit be limited to soldiers? A farmer injured in Kansas is just as worthy of fast medical care as a soldier wounded in France. We're simply applying wartime lessons to peacetime needs." The model spread rapidly. By 1950, 17 American cities had air ambulance services. By 1960, it was standard practice in most developed nations. The helicopter, perfected during the war's final years, became the primary vehicle, able to land anywhere, reach remote locations, transport patients directly from accident scenes to trauma centers. The flight nurse profession transitioned smoothly to civilian life. Universities began offering specialized training in aerospace medicine and air ambulance operations. The women who'd flown into combat zones over Normandy and Sicily became instructors, passing their hard-won knowledge to new generations. By 1955, air ambulance nursing was a recognized medical specialty with its own certification and professional standards. When war came to Korea in 1950, American military medical aviation was ready from day one. Helicopters, used sparingly in World War II, became the primary evacuation vehicle. The principles remained the same: rapid stabilization, immediate evacuation, delivery to surgical hospitals within the golden hour when survival chances were highest. Captain George Mitchell, commanding the 44th Medical Helicopter Company in Korea, had studied World War II evacuation records extensively. "We're standing on the shoulders of giants," he told his pilots. "The nurses and pilots who invented this system in 1943 gave us the blueprint. We're just refining it with better technology." The refinement was dramatic. In Korea, average time from wounding to surgery dropped to 37 minutes. Mortality rates fell to 1.7%, the lowest in the history of warfare. The MASH units, Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, were designed around the assumption of helicopter evacuation. They didn't need to be close to the front because helicopters brought the front to them. Vietnam saw further evolution. Medevac helicopters became iconic. The UH-1 Huey, with its distinctive sound, landing in jungle clearings under fire to extract wounded soldiers. Between 1965 and 1973, Army medevac helicopters flew over 500,000 missions and evacuated more than 900,000 patients. The survival rate for soldiers who reached medical care exceeded 98%. Major Robert Hughes, who'd flown C-47 medical missions over France in 1944 and commanded helicopter medical units in Vietnam in 1967, saw the direct lineage. The technology changed: propellers to rotors, metal matting airstrips to jungle clearings, fixed wing to vertical takeoff, but the principles are identical to what we learned in 1943. Rapid extraction, skilled in-flight care, delivery to surgical capability. It worked then, it works now. Today, medical helicopters are so commonplace we barely notice them. In any major city, the sound of a medevac helicopter heading to or from a trauma center is background noise, as ordinary as sirens or traffic. But that ordinariness represents one of the great success stories of applied innovation. Every year, medical aviation in the United States alone transports over 550,000 patients. Globally, the number exceeds 2 million. Survival rates for major trauma, car accidents, industrial injuries, violent crime are higher than ever because victims reach definitive care within minutes instead of hours. The golden hour concept, pioneered in World War II, is now fundamental to emergency medicine worldwide. The technical evolution has been remarkable. Modern air ambulances carry equipment that would have seemed miraculous in 1944. Ventilators, defibrillators, blood products, ultrasound, real-time communication with hospitals. Flight nurses and paramedics can perform procedures in the air that once required operating rooms. But the core mission remains what it was in 1943: get the patient to definitive care as fast as possible. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, Director of Emergency Medical Services for the state of Colorado, sees the direct connection to wartime innovation. Every protocol we use, every principle of rapid transport trauma care traces back to World War II. The flight nurses who flew into Normandy under fire established the standards we still follow. When I train new flight crews, I tell them they're part of a tradition that started 80 years ago with people who refused to accept that wounded men had to die slowly. That tradition demands excellence because lives depend on it. In 2015, on the 70th anniversary of VE Day, a remarkable gathering took place in Washington. The few surviving flight nurses from World War II, women now in their 90s, met with modern flight nurses and paramedics. Lieutenant Catherine Hayes, who'd flown into Normandy on D-Day and completed 247 missions, spoke to a room full of current medical aviation professionals. "We didn't think we were doing anything special," Hayes told them, her voice still strong at 94. "We were just doing our jobs, trying to save lives. But I've lived long enough to see what we started. Every time I hear a medical helicopter, every time I read about someone surviving because they reached a trauma center quickly, I think about the soldiers we brought out of France and Italy and Germany. We saved them, yes, but we also created something that keeps saving lives, decade after decade. That's what I'm most proud of. Not what we did, but what it became." Lieutenant Margaret Wilson, who'd flown 312 missions, added her perspective. "People ask me about the danger, about flying into combat zones, but we never thought about the danger. We thought about the wounded soldiers depending on us. That focus, keeping your attention on the mission and the patients, that's what made the system work. And it's what still makes it work today." The veterans of that system, pilots like Robert Shaw and Andrew Morrison, nurses like Hayes and Wilson and Dorothy Richardson, medics like Leonard Fisher, they created something that outlasted the war, outlasted them, became woven into the fabric of modern civilization. Most of them never sought recognition. Many died without ever knowing the full scope of what they had begun. Statistics can measure the success of air medical evacuation. 1.1 million evacuated, 97.5% survival rate, mortality reduced by 75% compared to previous wars, but statistics can't measure the real impact. The weddings that happened because a groom survived wounds in Normandy, the children born because their fathers came home from France, the careers and contributions and ordinary lives that continued because someone decided to lift the wounded into the sky. James Davison, evacuated from St. Lo in July 1944, became a civil engineer and designed bridges across the American West. Daniel Brenner, pulled from Omaha Beach on D-Day, returned to Ohio, became a teacher, influenced 3 generations of students. Michael Stevens, unconscious with a head wound when Catherine Hayes flew him to England, recovered fully and founded a construction company that built schools and hospitals. Each life saved rippled outward through time, touching hundreds of other lives. And that multiplication continues. The man saved by an air ambulance after a car accident in Colorado becomes a doctor who saves others. The woman flown from a remote accident scene in Australia survives to raise children who make their own contributions. The system that began with desperate innovation in the deserts of North Africa now spans the globe, saves millions, and will continue saving millions as long as humans value human life. On June 6, 2024, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, medical helicopters across America flew with red crosses prominently displayed in honor of the World War II flight nurses and pilots who pioneered air medical evacuation. It was a small gesture, barely noticed by most people, but deeply meaningful to those who understand the history. The Germans were right about one thing in 1943 when they called American air evacuation impossible. By every conventional standard, by all previous military medical doctrine, it should have been impossible. The wounded couldn't survive flight, the risks were too great, the logistics were too complex, it couldn't be done. But someone decided to try anyway. Someone decided that impossible was just a word, not a fact. Someone decided that saving lives mattered more than following doctrine. And that decision, that willingness to attempt the impossible in service of preserving human life, changed everything. Today, when a medical helicopter lifts off from a hospital roof, when an air ambulance crew races against time to save a life, when a trauma surgeon receives a critical patient within the golden hour, that's the legacy, not of technology or equipment, but of the fundamental principle that human life is worth any effort, any innovation, any risk to preserve. The Americans didn't just rescue the wounded by airplane. They proved that the impossible could become routine, that innovation could defeat death, that courage and determination could change the very nature of medicine. And in doing so, they gave a gift that keeps giving, generation after generation, life after life. Perhaps that's what makes this story truly remarkable. It's not history. It's still happening, every day, all around us. The revolution continues. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.